was just to see bears. I just wanted to see some bears.
We get like wolves. Like we guys to like go in the wolf pen.
Oh, nice.
It was really cool.
Yeah. All right. So do y'all have timeline stuff for today? Okay.
They're somewhere in here. Yeah.
All right. So whoever's ready, just go ahead and begin.
I'm not even gonna lie to you. I've had these timeline submissions,
Uh-huh.
but I don't remember what dates you said, so these are correct dates.
Okay.
I have 1780.
Okay. Yep.
Okay. 1780, Justice Bueller declares that a man may be his wife. This claim of Bueller being caricatured by James Gilray. Gilray?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, in 1782.
Okay. Yeah. Remember, Gilray is the same guy who did those French Revolution caricatures that we
Oh,
looked
yeah.
at several weeks ago. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then in 1893, the Methodist Conference bans women from preaching. And then in 1832, the Greek Reform Act bans all women from voting, caused a women's strike in Yorkshire.
Uh-huh. All right. So I've actually got some poster board up here now. So
Oh, wow.
Go ahead and put those up. Yeah. Caroline, go ahead.
Okay, so the romantic I have 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote a vindication of the right of woman.
Uh-huh.
In this work, she expresses how she feels about educating women. Women should be educated alongside men, and this would make them better wives, mothers, but it would also give them the ability to work and excel.
All right, good.
Okay, 1813, Jane Austen wrote Pride and Prejudice. Austen only published 4 novels in her lifetime, but she wrote much of her life, and now
That's 1835.
there are 3 manuscripts consisting of her plays, verses, short novels, and other prose, because she started, I can't remember, that was days ago. I can't remember when she started writing this down.
Uh-huh.
But anyway.
We know that the Jane Austen started writing in the late 18th century.
Yeah.
And yeah, her most famous works are the early 19th. Yeah. That's good enough.
Okay, in 1832, August 3rd, Mary Smith petitioned Henry Hunt that she, along with other spinsters, should have a voice.
Uh-huh.
This became the first women's suffrage. That's all I wrote.
Okay.
Petition. There
Yes.
it is. Petition presented to Parliament. Sorry.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Then, in 1866, John Stuart Mill presents first mass suffrage petition to the House of Commons. They had 1,500 signatures. Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then on April 15, 1868, Manchester National Society for Women's Suffrage holds for the first ever public meeting at Manchester Free Trade Hall. And then in 1894, the Local Government Act is passed, allowing married and single women the right to vote in election for county and borough councils.
All right.
Okay, then for today. Sorry, those are all from the other day.
Yeah, that's fine. No, this is great. Keep going.
So in 1915, the right to serve was the demand of the WSPU, Women's Social Political Union,
Mhm.
held. This was their only demand due to the division of opinions. Like a lot of them, half of them opposed and half of them were for the war.
Yeah.
Okay, in July 1914, 3.3 million women worked in paid employment in Britain. By July 1917, 4.7 million worked in employment.
Uh-huh.
They even served in uniform as well in the Royal Navy. In fact, the last known living vet from that war was Florence Green, who died in 2012. That's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, in 1914, Maria Bocch-Kariba, I can't read that name.
How do you spell it?
Bocchkareva. Bocch-Kariba? I don't know.
So this is
It's
Puerto Rico.
Russian.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Puerto Rico.
petitioned the Tsar for permission to enlist in the Imperial Russian Army and was granted permission to join. She was the first woman to lead a Russian military unit, and she overcame the harassment and ostracism and even the injuries from battle. She became a decorated soldier and commander.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to have some stuff to add here as well, mostly that has to do with women's education and with some kind of elements of the suffrage movement. Yeah, you've got the marker. You can go on up ahead and put some stuff up there. So I want to start by talking about education, which is particularly relevant to the Virginia Woolf pieces that we're talking about today. So for most of British history, women had no access to university education and very little formal education outside the home. Right? So while their brothers might be sent, particularly in the middle class as well, their brothers might be sent away to school, the girls stayed home and learned things like needlework and embroidery, maybe to play an instrument, household management and things of that nature, right? Then in 1849, the University of London opens Bedford College, right? The first college in England to admit women. It's separate from the other colleges within the University of London. And the Bedford women weren't taking their classes with men. It was also not a residential college. They didn't live there. But, and the other thing was that while women were permitted to attend classes, they could not take degrees. So you could be admitted to the university, but you couldn't matriculate, right? That is, you couldn't officially enroll as a student who would take a degree. Now, this rule was challenged in 1869 by a group of women who become known as damn it, why can't I spell? I should know how to spell Edinburgh. Who become known as the Edinburgh Seven. So these 7 women from across Britain, some are Scottish, some are English, some are Welsh, try to enroll at the University of Edinburgh as medical students. And the university admits them. However, a court later declares that they should not have been admitted and thus could not take medical degrees. Right? They were not legally permitted to matriculate at a university. However, this generates a good deal of publicity for the broader British women's movement. Right? This denial of these women, whom apparently the University of Edinburgh had deemed qualified to enter their medical program. In the same year, the University of Cambridge, right, one of Britain's 2 great so-called ancient universities, or the medieval English universities, founds Girton College, which, like Bedford College is specifically for women, and like Bedford College doesn't actually offer degrees, but is residential, right? Women can go and live there. Oxford, meanwhile, doesn't found its first women's college until 1878. Right. Traditionally, Oxford has been more conservative than Cambridge, or has been regarded anyway as more conservative than Cambridge. And this is a case where, they're about a decade behind Cambridge. In the same year, the University of London obtains permission to grant degrees to women. But it's still another 25 years before a woman is actually appointed a professor at a British university. And the first woman to obtain a position as a professor is Millicent Mackenzie, who was hired as a professor of education at the University of Wales. So, one thing that we might notice here is that these changes tend to happen on the fringes of Britain first, right? They often originate in Scotland, in Wales, or in the Midlands, and then kind of trickle out to the more conservative center. And it's not until 1939 that Oxford or Cambridge hires a woman professor. Dorothy Garrod, who taught archaeology, was hired as a professor at the University of Cambridge in 1939. So when Mina Loy and Virginia Woolf are writing these pieces, right, they are writing kind of like in an environment in which women's higher education is still a pretty new thing, right? Women have only had the opportunity to even go to university in Britain by, say, like 1914, when Mina Loy is writing, for about, maybe, 2.5 generations at that point. And, this would still have only impacted a very small number of women who happened to already live in London. Now, around this same time, there's a new kind of like idea of women's life and opportunities that's opening up, right? So we recall from last time, right, the angel in the house and the fallen woman, right? Or from the last week or so. And we've noted that these two stereotypes don't actually adequately cover what most women's lives were like. But a third stereotype begins to emerge in the 1880s that comes to be referred to as the new woman. And the new woman is resistant to traditional ideas of middle-class femininity. Right, so the whole Victoria and Albert thing, right? Dainty mother looking tenderly over the children while father sternly stands by and watches, right? This is something that the new woman is kind of pushing back, or the idea of the new woman is pushing back against, right? So the new woman is financially independent. Right? Either she has her own money from an inheritance or she works. She's not dependent on a husband or any other male relative for her living. The new woman also occasionally adopted what were regarded as masculine habits, things like cigar smoking and whiskey drinking. right? Wearing pants, the horror. Getting her hair cut short. And scandal of scandals, riding a bicycle, which their mothers and grandmothers' generations would have regarded as scandalous and unladylike. Because you can't sit side saddle on a bicycle. We're laughing, but I'm perfectly serious. Right? This is unfortunately.
They can go because of down and back. To be honest.
Yeah.
Because at one point,
Uh-huh.
one of the girls starts riding side saddle, and her dad's like, "Are you sure you can hunt like that?" And it just made me laugh when the show was on. So it made me giggle when you said that, and it
Yeah.
popped in my head.
Yeah, that was the ladylike way to ride a horse, right? You were supposed to ride side saddle. If you try to do that with a bicycle, it just doesn't go anywhere, right? You fall over. So yeah, so the new woman is also much more likely to have been educated in one of these new institutions, right? They might not have been able to take a degree, but they've learned enough to be able, to work in some educated profession on their own, right? Even if they don't have that qualification. And so this prompts a good deal of thinking regarding women's role in society, right? Now, on the one hand, the more conservative elements of society are aghast at this, right? That this is, the breakdown of all that is true and good. If women start dressing like men and smoking like men and riding bicycles like men, then pretty soon they're going to want to vote like men. And that is kind of what happened, right? So I've got a map here I want to pass out to y'all. And the cities here that I've drawn stars around are those in which powerful and influential women's suffrage groups had sprung up by the 1870s. Now, what city do we notice here seems to have always been at the center of just about any agitation? London is always, what's that?
Edinburgh?
Yeah, Edinburgh is the capital of Scotland, right? It's the biggest city in Scotland. And Scotland has traditionally been the poorest part of the UK. There is often a lot of unrest that comes out of there. But I think I just heard somebody say Manchester. Yeah, remember, think back to the labor movement as well, right? That a lot of labor agitation was coming out of Manchester even at the end of the 18th century, right? That Manchester was always a kind of hotbed of unrest. And indeed, one of the most powerful and important suffrage organizations of the early 20th century, which I believe you mentioned, the WPSU? You did. Okay, yeah. Was based in Manchester and was run by Emmeline Pankhurst and her two daughters, Sylvia and Christabel.
I read that.
Uh-huh.
I was reading about that.
Yep. So
there were no
yeah.
dates.
What's that?
There were no dates.
They didn't give dates. Okay, yeah, so.
That's why I didn't put it.
Right. Yeah, the date actually for the WPSU is 1903. That's when it's founded. And eventually, one of the daughters, Sylvia, would split from her mother and sister's movement. Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst believed that the vote should be only extended to the upper and upper middle classes. And Sylvia Pankhurst had gotten involved with socialists and communists and believed that the vote should be extended to everyone and that they should be evangelizing among the working classes as well. So she becomes persona non grata with her mother and sister and is eventually kind of shoved out. But the Pankhurst movement is much less genteel than those 1870s suffrage societies, which were primarily involved in writing letters to newspapers and trying to put pressure on local politicians to introduce suffrage bills, right? The Pankhursts introduce a number of more colorful tactics. For one thing, hunger strikes. Right, public marches and demonstrations. And in fact, like when you think about suffragettes walking up and down the streets with signs and sashes, right, this is the movement you're probably thinking of, right? This is not something that was happening much before 1903. They were also into window breaking. Right? They would toss bricks through windows of government buildings to get attention. And now and again, a little bit of arson, though always of unoccupied buildings. And the window breaking and the arson and the marches were essentially designed to trigger nuisance laws that would get them arrested, which would get them attention, and would give them the opportunity, for, say, like a hunger strike, something like that, right? And ultimately, this strategy succeeds. I mean, it takes a while, but in 1919, Parliament grants limited suffrage to women of property over 30. And also allows women of property over 30 to be elected to the House of Commons, right, for the first time. Women could always stand for election. Anybody could stand for election, but you couldn't be sworn in and actually take your seat unless you met the particular criteria, right? And then the sky didn't fall, right? It was not the end of everything as we know it. Things seemed to work out just fine. So by 1928, Parliament extends the franchise to all Britons over the age of 21. Right, so any British adults over 21, whether they own property or not, no matter how much property they owned, whether they were male or female, now had the right to vote. And this is the basic atmosphere that Loy and Woolf are both writing in, right? Although Loy is coming at the issue from a much more radical perspective than Woolf is. So what did you think of these two pieces that I asked you to read for today?
The manifesto was interesting.
Okay, interesting. Okay, well, what was interesting about it? Was there anything that like kind of surprised you or felt weird about it?
Super weird.
What's that?
Super weird.
Okay.
It was super weird. I don't really understand
Okay.
I feel like she may be fascist.
Okay, why did you feel like she may be fascist? That's interesting. What suggested fascism to you?
Okay, so there was something it was like she was saying that they needed to be, that the women needed to be smart to vote. It didn't need to just be all women. It needed to be
Okay.
educated women.
Okay, I think I see probably which passage you're thinking about. If we look on page 207, are you looking at
I'm trying to remember what it was.
every woman of superior intelligence should
Yeah.
realize her race responsibility in producing children in adequate proportion to the unfit or degenerate members of her
Yes.
sex? Yeah, this is really
Fascist.
kind of disturbing. Yeah, I mean, this is. It's a
I
similar. This,
I
yeah.
was like, what is wrong with her? Because we talked about that in education class, because it was
Uh-huh.
the book we were reading. And it was after Hitler, somebody in the US, I can't remember his name, was saying we had to create a society and
Uh-huh.
pair the correct people together to have children. We had, like, circuses would have pretty people and do, I can't remember all of it. It was so weird.
Yeah.
And that is what it sounded like to me.
Mhm. Like this?
Yeah, that was
Yep.
it. Yeah. I can't
Yeah.
remember what it was called.
Yeah, and eugenics is,
That's exactly what.
yeah, like even outside of explicitly fascist thinking, which 1914 would be a little early for out and out fascism, right? You don't really see like genuine fascists appearing until the 1920s and the 1930s. And indeed, like there's a lot more, it's kind of harder in this period to distinguish left from right sometimes. Right? Fascism being the kind of like the political right taken to its extreme, communism being the political left taken to its extreme, right? But yeah, there's definitely the language of eugenics in here, right? This idea that superior women should be producing at least as many, if not more, children than unfit or degenerate women, right? This notion that there are superior.
Yeah, but I just didn't understand, like, when I was reading that, I was thinking, why can't you just have that all-around opinion instead of just about women? Like,
Mhm.
that bothered me. Why aren't you just saying that it was just wrong? I get that this feminist manifesto stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that what were you able to pick up on, like what the basic argument she's trying to make is about relations between men and women? What does she think feminists in 1914 are doing wrong?
That they're not just battling it out fully for everything. They're not trying to get everything. They're just trying to get pieces of the pie.
Okay, they're
They're
just
not
kind
trying to
of
get the whole pie.
fighting for crumbs, right?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. And what exactly are they fighting to get? Like, what are those crumbs?
Like when she asks, is that all you want? Professional and commercial careers, is that all you want?
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think you're thinking along the right lines here, right? I mean, think about like, if we think about like this, the new woman that's emerged, you know, about a generation before Loy starts writing this, right? the new woman is entering a masculine world, right? And attempting to compete on masculine terms. Right? So part of what Loy is arguing here is that if you are simply trying to make your way, like to, insinuate yourself into a world that has been made by men for men.
Remaking?
Yeah, you're accepting their basic premises of reality, right? And that what you need to do, what you should be fighting to do, is remake that reality, right?
Yeah.
Into something more genuinely equitable, right? It's not equitable if, in order to get respected, a woman has to behave like a man, or in a way that a man approves of.
Yeah, because it says a woman from her happiness must retain her deceptive fragility of her appearance,
Uh-huh.
combined with indomitable will, irreducible courage, and abundant health.
Uh-huh.
Like, retain your deceptive fragility? Okay.
Yeah, and that's a weird phrase, right?
I see. See, I wasn't picking up, I didn't pick that up. I was just
Uh-huh.
thinking, so what, I didn't understand what you were trying to say. I did not get that.
But you did still pick up
On her opinion.
on the creepy eugenic
Yeah.
aspect of this, right?
Yeah.
Which is even stranger, considering that Loy herself, her birth name was Mina Luvi, and she was half Jewish.
Yeah. That's probably.
But yeah, I mean, the basic argument that Loy is trying to make is that men and women are not the same.
See, that's why I did think that she was trying to say that they're
Yeah.
not the same, but
Uh-huh.
I still was confused as to what her point was. Like, she was saying, this is what we were supposed to do, but you still have to be a mom, you still have to do this, you still have to do that, and I was like,
Well, and I think that she's not looking at being a mother as a negative thing, right? So, like, if we look at a lot of, particularly like a lot of second wave feminism, like feminism of say like the 50s to the 80s, right? There's a tendency to regard motherhood as a kind of trap. That it's basically like kind of like a way that men trap women in the home and make them into helpmates rather than independent people with their own thoughts and feelings. This is also the generation that introduces us to the pantsuit, right? Loy would have found the pantsuit ridiculous. And also the idea that motherhood is something that women aren't supposed to embrace. She's thinking of motherhood not as something that men force on women, but something that is natural to them.
Right.
That they can actually, like, apart from at least like getting the second essential element there, getting the zygote made, that women can actually pretty much do without men.
okay, yeah.
And that this is a particular power and responsibility that women have themselves, right? And I think what she is trying to develop is a more specifically feminine concept of motherhood that isn't built around the idea of a woman and her children being property of her husband. Right, so let's just take a second and go to page 206. Can I get somebody to read the paragraph there that starts with, to obtain results, you must make sacrifices.
To obtain results, you must make sacrifices, and the first and greatest sacrifice you have to make is of your virtue. The fictitious value of woman as identified with her physical purity is too easy a standby, rendering her lethargic in the acquisition of intrinsic merits of character by which she could obtain a concrete value. Therefore, the first self-enforced law for the female sex as a protection against the man-made bogey of virtue, which is the principal instrument of her subjection, will be the unconditional surgical destruction of virginity throughout the female population after puberty.
Now, why is she suggesting surgical destruction of every woman's virginity at puberty? This seems like a weird thing to suggest, right?
For the sake of pissing them off. Like, that's what I thought it meant.
Well, let's think also back to the last couple of sessions, right? And how virtue is defined in Victorian sexual discourse. What does it mean? What does virtue mean?
Like your purity.
Yeah, purity, chastity, virginity, right? So, say, your Victorian husband, 35 to 40 years old, marries his 17-year-old bride and discovers on their wedding night that she is not a virgin. Shock, shock, horror, right? Because part of the contract, right, at least as Loy is arguing here, is that one of the things that your husband is basically purchasing is your virtue, your virginity, right? So take that out of the equation, make that a non-element, right? And then it's harder for your husband to turn you into property or to claim that he owns you in some way, right? So that's why she's suggesting this, it's actually a fairly kind of clever takedown of the angel in the house, fallen woman dichotomy, right? Make everybody a fallen woman from the outset, and then you can't divide women up into these categories, right? Then this doesn't matter anymore. And what does matter is how a woman behaves on her own merits, right? So does this start to make a little more sense to y'all? Yeah, I mean, it's still like the way she phrases it is often a little confusing, right? And the fact that she's doing this in this very early 20th century manifesto style, right? But can y'all see why she didn't publish this in her lifetime? Yeah, particularly for 1914, right?
It's almost like she just had some wild thoughts and she just decided to keep them to herself,
Yeah, I mean, and she didn't keep them to herself. She basically mailed this to a friend, right? But it was kind of clear that she never really intended this for publication. And it didn't actually appear in print until 1982. Now, Virginia Woolf, on the other hand, very much intended for her remarks to be published, right? So let's look at the way she is trying to deal with these specters of Victorian womanhood. Let's start with professions for women because it's a little bit simpler, a little bit short on page 400, right? So there are a couple of things here that she seems to acknowledge that a woman needs in order to start a career as a writer, right? When your secretary invited me to come here, she told me that your society is concerned with the employment of women, and she suggested that I might tell you something about my own professional experiences. It is true I am a woman. It is true I am employed. But what professional experiences have I had? It is difficult to say. My profession is literature, and in that profession, there are fewer experiences for women than in any other, with the exception of the stage. Fewer, I mean, that are peculiar to women. For the road was cut many years ago by Fanny Burney, by Aphra Behn, by Harriet Martineau, by Jane Austen, by George Eliot. Many famous women, and many more unknown and forgotten, have been before me, making the path smooth and regulating my steps. Thus, when I came to write, there were very few material obstacles in my way. Writing was a reputable and harmless occupation. The family peace was not broken by the scratching of a pen. No demand was made upon the family purse. For 10 and 6 one can buy enough paper to write all the plays of Shakespeare if one has a mind that way. Pianos and models, Paris, Vienna, and Berlin, masters and mistresses are not needed by a writer. The cheapness of writing paper is, of course, the reason why women have succeeded as writers before they have succeeded in the other professions. So let's kind of note here, like particularly the second half of this, right? Why is writing an easier profession for her to follow than, say, painting or sculpture or music? It's cheap, yeah. Paper is cheap. So one thing that she acknowledges is an obstacle for women entering any kind of profession, right, are the material conditions. Necessary to enter that profession. So to be a writer, you need to be able to afford paper, right? You need materials. But then what else do you need that might also be impacted by your material conditions, by, like, say, your family's income and social standing? Okay, you need a pen, sure. Before you can even use a paper and a pen, what do you need? What do you need to know?
All right, how to read.
Yeah, you need to know how to read and write, right? So you have to have had at least a rudimentary education, right? Right. Better than rudimentary, probably, if you want to be able to write well. So, can I get someone to continue on here but to tell you my story, it is a simple one.
To tell you my story is a simple one. Oh, wait, where? Okay.
Yep.
But to tell you my story, it is a simple one. You have only got to figure to yourself a girl in a bedroom with a pen in her hand. She had only to move that pen from left to right, from 10 o'clock to 1. Then it occurred to her to do what is simple and cheap enough after all. To slip a few of those pages into an envelope, fix a penny stamp in the corner, and drop the envelope into a red box at the corner. It was thus that I became a journalist. And my effort was rewarded on the first day of the following month. A very glorious day it was for me. By a letter from an editor containing a check. It is check.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
Okay.
check, yep.
For £1, 10 shillings, and 6 pence. But to show you how little I deserve to be called a professional woman, how little I know of the struggles and difficulties of such lives, I have to admit that instead of spending that sum upon bread and butter, rent, shoes, and stockings, or butcher's bills, I went out and bought a cat, a beautiful cat, a Persian cat, which very soon involved me in bitter disputes with my neighbors.
Okay, thank you. So what does this indicate? Like, what else does this tell us about the material conditions that Woolf is working under?
To know the struggle.
Yeah. She doesn't really have to worry about money, right? She has the leisure to do things like write short stories or novels or articles for magazines, because it ultimately doesn't matter all that much if she gets paid for it. She's already got enough money to live on. And Woolf socially is coming from a different position than Mina Loy was, right? So Mina Loy, being half Jewish and of sort of European parentage, is kind of more of an outsider in British culture than Woolf is. Woolf is, in a lot of ways, a kind of super insider, right? Her father was a well-known scholar. Her mother also came from a famous family. And she and her husband, Leonard, lived in a fashionable London neighborhood called Bloomsbury, where they were at the center of a social group known as the Bloomsbury Group, most of whom were Cambridge graduates who would get together for dinners and discussions of art and politics and occasional strange sexual entanglements. The chart of relationships between the Bloomsbury folks is, let's just say, complicated, right? So we're looking at a group that, kind of like in the 20s and 30s, particularly, is wealthy, well-educated, and socially liberal, right? In fact, the Bloomsbury group might, like if they, the kind of people today we might call, say, like limousine liberals, right? They're, well-heeled, of liberal opinions, but doing fine for themselves, right? So this is the social milieu that she's operating in, and is really kind of queen of. Right? She and her husband Leonard are really at the center of this whole group. So she has more leisure, more money, more opportunity, as she acknowledges here, to make her way as a writer than an ordinary woman might. But this doesn't mean that there are no struggles involved. Can I get somebody to start reading the next paragraph that starts with, what could be easier than to write articles and buy Persian cats with the profits?
What could be easier than to write articles and buy Persian cats with the profits? But wait a moment. Articles have to be about something. Mine, I seem to remember, was about a novel by a famous man. And while I was writing this review, I discovered that if I were going to review books, I should need to do a battle with a certain phantom. And the phantom was a woman. And when I came to know her better, I called her after the heroine of the famous poem, The Angel in the House. It was she who used to come between me and my paper when I was writing reviews. It was she who bothered and wasted my time and so tormented me that at last I killed her. You who come of a younger and happier generation may not have heard her. You may not know what I mean by the angel in the house. I will describe her as shortly as I can. She was intensely sympathetic. She was immensely charming. She was utterly unselfish. She was excelled in the difficult arts of family life. She was sacrificed herself daily. If there was a chicken, she took a leg. If there was a drought, she sat in it. In short, she was so constituted that she never had a mind or a wish of her own, but preferred to sympathize on always with the minds and wishes of others. Above all, I need not say it, she was pure. Her purity was supposed to be her chief beauty, her blushes, her great grace. In those days, the last of Queen Victoria, every house had its angel, and when I came to write, I encountered her with the very first words. The shadow of her wings fell on my page. I heard the rustling of her skirts in the room. Directly, that is to say, I took my pen in my hand to review the novel by a famous man. She slipped behind me and whispered, "My dear, you are a young woman. You are writing about a book that has been written by a man. Be sympathetic, be tender, flatter the seed. Use all the arts and wiles of our sex. Never let anybody guess that you have a mind of your own. Above all, be pure." And she made as if to guide my pen.
Okay, stop there, right? So how does the angel in the house get in her way when she's trying to write?
She's trying to make it seem like that she needs to be like,
Yeah.
kind of don't like hurt them, no constructive criticism.
Yeah. Because remember, what was the Victorian angel in the house's role in the family? What was the thing she was supposed to be?
Protecting
Yeah, protect him from going astray, right? To be his kind of gentle, loving, moral compass. And certainly, right, not to be critical or cruel, right?
Not judge him.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Live for others and guide them gently in your way, right? And so, when she actually has to honestly write a critique of a novel by a man, right, this Ghost, right, which is really, you know, her own kind of social conditioning here, is getting in the way. Right? So in order to be able to write this review honestly, she has to be able to overcome this social conditioning, metaphorically kill the angel, and then get on with the business of writing, right? So for someone in Woolf's position, right, the argument that she's making is that while she has no particular material worries when, you know, trying to express herself honestly in writing, her social conditioning initially worked against her to prevent her from publishing honestly, right? Now, let's look at the other Woolf piece here, which is primarily concerned with why there are so few women writers in history at all, right? And I want to look specifically here at the story of Shakespeare's sister, right? Starting on page 395, right? So she first tells the story of this old bishop who used to write letters to the newspaper saying that women could not have written the plays of Shakespeare, and also that cats don't go to heaven. Right? So, trivial, I know it's sad, right? Dogs do. Dogs certainly do.
Oh,
100%.
I mean, there was a movie about it.
my cats are good.
Okay, I promise dogs do.
Yep. But she actually agrees with this old bishop, at least on the point about women not being able to write the plays of Shakespeare in the age of Shakespeare. Why does she think a woman could not have written Shakespeare's plays?
Because he was educated.
Yeah,
And she would not be able to be educated.
she would not be able to be educated, right?
Even if she tried to educate herself, she wouldn't be allowed.
Yeah. Essentially, her social conditioning would prevent it, right? Everybody around her would prevent her from doing this because it's not what she's supposed to be doing, right? It's against the rules. Her parents are at first confused by it and then, become violent and then plead with her, right? Any education she gets, she has to sort of steal for herself by looking at his books. And he gets away with a lot of shit too, right, that she wouldn't. If we look at the description here on page 395 of William Shakespeare's known youthful misadventures, right? He was, it is well known, a wild boy who poached rabbits, perhaps shot a deer, and had, rather sooner than he could have done, or than he should have done, to marry a woman in the neighborhood who bore him a child rather quicker than was right. That escapade sent him to seek his fortune in London. So, what's happening? What has he done? Yeah, he gets a woman pregnant, marries her apparently to satisfy the forms, right? And then does he stick around?
No.
Yeah, then he runs off to London as fast as he can, right? Yeah. Leaving her in the lurch. Would his sister have the same opportunity? Yeah, simple biology would dictate not, right? And in fact, when she finds herself in a similar situation, she commits suicide. Because it basically means the end of her dreams. So the basic point that she's trying to make is that in Shakespeare's day, right, ideas about what a woman's proper place was would make it next to impossible for a woman, even as talented as Shakespeare, to have actually written his plays, right? And so a lot of what she's focused on here is the historical situation of women and what we actually know about women's lives in past periods. So if we look on page 396, I just want to point to a paragraph here, right? After the story of Judith Shakespeare. It's like that more or less is how the story would run, I think, if a woman in Shakespeare's day had had Shakespeare's genius. But for my part, I agree with the deceased bishop, if such he was. It is unthinkable that any woman in Shakespeare's day should have had Shakespeare's genius. For genius like Shakespeare's is not born among laboring, uneducated, servile people. It was not born in England among the Saxons and Britons. It is not born today among the working classes. How, then, could it have been born among women whose work began, according to Professor Trevelyan, almost before they were out of the nursery, who were forced to it by their parents and held to it by all the power of law and custom? So, why does Woolf think genius is not born among women or among the working classes? This sounds snobbish, right? And maybe is a little bit. But what does she mean by this?
I mean, she says that if they were in the working classes or whatever, then they would like before they were out of the nursery, they would be held to the power of law and custom.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and so I don't know.
Yeah, well, let's try to think about it another way. Do either of you ever have to take care of small children? Do either of you have a full-time job? So you nodded to both, right? How easy is it for you to get work done for your classes?
Nearly impossible.
Yeah, okay, so like even just like sitting down and getting some reading done or writing an assignment, right? When you've got all this other shit to do, all these other things demanding your attention, it's really difficult to do any kind of intellectual work because one, you don't have privacy, right? And two, you can't concentrate. And this is why she's saying that, at least in these historical periods, right, genius was not born among the laboring classes or among women, right, because they simply didn't have the time or the privacy or the space to think. Right? There's always something or someone demanding that you do something for them. And the second you sit down and get a minute to yourself, and maybe you just try to read a book, somebody's bugging you, right? Mom, I'm hungry, or darn my socks, dear, or whatever, right? Which makes it really, really hard to do any kind of creative work, certainly. Now to continue
I don't
on.
have any of my own. However, my dog, first week of classes, had such terrible diarrhea that it was literally, I know that sounds so dumb, but I'm not kidding. I kept thinking if I had a child, there's no way I would be able to do anything right now.
Yeah. No, I believe you. Like as a dog owner, I know exactly what you mean. Like when
It was every time I turned around, it was on my carpet, and I was just
And I also Luna is really, really good about not doing her business in the house.
Yeah, Bella was very sick.
But like when she really has to go,
Right.
And it's always like right when I sit down and try to work on something, right? It's like, Dad, I gotta go outside. I'm gonna poop.
I swear, it was like 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning. I mean, it was so I mean, I was
Uh-huh.
literally staying up doing homework after
Yeah.
work, and it was, I literally thought I was going to just die. Like, I
Uh-huh.
didn't think I was gonna make it.
Yeah.
And it was literally the first week of class. Well, not the first, it was the second
Uh-huh.
week of classes, and I was like, I don't know, what do
Sure.
I can't do it, I can't do it.
Sure, and also, yeah, a 3-year-old pit bull doesn't understand what it means when I'm sitting in a chair with a book, right,
Right.
and a pen.
Yeah.
She's gonna come and she wants to play. She's gonna drop her toy in my lap, and she's gonna get upset if I don't grab it.
That's what I kept saying to my mom on the phone. I was like, I can't do it. I don't know why many kids. I could not.
Uh-huh. So yeah, this is the big obstacle, right? Just if you've got too much other shit to do and too many other people demanding things from you. Like she said, this is the basic story of women's lives throughout British history. Now, to continue on here, though, right? Yet genius of a sort must have existed among women as it must have existed among the working classes. Now and again, an Emily Bronte or a Robert Burns blazes out and proves its presence. But certainly it never got itself onto paper. When, however, one reads of a witch being ducked, of a woman possessed by devils, of a wise woman selling herbs, or even of a very remarkable man who had a mother, then I think we are on the track of a lost novelist, a suppressed poet, of some mute and inglorious Jane Austen, some Emily Bronte who dashed her brains out on the moor or mopped and mowed about the highways, crazed with the torture that her gift had put her to. So, what's she saying here about how women's genius expresses itself when it's thwarted?
Expresses itself in other ways, like when they're doing like their actual jobs or whatever.
Yeah, or it ends up looking to most people like insanity or eccentricity, right? It's like, oh, there's that woman with a pen and paper again, a witch, right? Right? I love the old supposed test for whether or not a woman is a witch. If we throw her in the pond, and if she floats, she's a witch. And if she drowns, she dies anyway. But at least she wasn't a witch. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I guess what she's arguing is these supposed witches, right, may very well have simply been intelligent, creative women with no outlet who look crazy or look sinister to their neighbors. Yeah. And they either do the Judith Shakespeare thing and end up killing themselves, or society judges them harshly and takes care of that for them. So I think this actually sets us up pretty well for the Doris Lessing piece you guys are going to read for next time. So it's a short story about a middle-class marriage. And in particular, a middle-class professional woman who kind of ends up in exactly the kinds of traps described by Loy and by Woolf, and what she ultimately does about them. In particular, Woolf calls the earlier piece here a room of one's own, right? Kind of referring to the fact that if a woman wants to write, the first thing she needs is privacy. So I want you to keep that title, A Room of One's Own, in your mind as you read to room 19. And let me just call it up for you. And I do just want to say too, to both of you, thanks for always having things to say. I know this is a small class, But I love it when, like, that you're not afraid to ask questions when you don't understand something, and that you're not afraid to talk. So yeah, keep that up.
I assume so you're